Title: The Hollow of Willow Creek. Chapter 1. The first steps into the hollow. Ethan stepped out of the car and onto the damp earth of Willow Creek. His boots sank slightly into the mud as the cold, dense fog clung to the ground like a living thing. The air was thick with moisture, the kind of dampness that seemed to seep into your bones, leaving a chill that no amount of clothing could fully repel. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, but it didn't do much to fight off the feeling of dread gnawing at his insides. Willow Creek wasn't supposed to be here, not in any normal sense. It didn't appear on any of the maps he had studied, nor did it show up on satellite images. Yet, here he was, standing on its outskirts, with nothing but the eerie glow of a dying sun overhead. There had been nothing but forest for miles until he reached this place. Now, as his eyes scanned the rows of dilapidated houses that lined the narrow street, a tightness settled in his chest. The houses, if they could still be called houses, were mostly empty shells. Their wooden frames had begun to rot from years of neglect, and the paint that once adorned the walls had long since peeled away, leaving the homes looking like hollowed-out corpses. Their eyes, windows, staring back at him with a silent, accusatory gaze. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, the kind that felt unnatural, like the world itself had ceased its normal rhythm just to watch him. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath. Ethan had been searching for something. He wasn't sure what. Perhaps an answer, or perhaps a way to reconcile the vague memories from his childhood that had haunted him since the death of his mother. She had always warned him about Willow Creek, her voice trembling when she spoke of it. Her eyes, wide with a strange kind of fear, would always snap to the shadows whenever she mentioned the town, as though something there watched her, watched them. It wasn't until after her death that Ethan discovered her journals, hidden away in an old wooden chest at the back of the attic. Pages upon pages were filled with scribbled warnings, cryptic notes about Willow Creek, its origins, and the dark presence she claimed resided there. She had written of a deal struck long ago, of a cursed entity that had a hand in the very foundation of the town. But she had never told him what it was, not outright. Not until her last days, when her mind had begun to fray at the edges, when the whispers started, and when the shadows began to follow her even into the safety of their home. The strangest part, she had told him that someday he would come to Willow Creek, whether he liked it or not. And so, here he was, standing at the entrance to the town, the weight of her words pressing heavily on him. There was no one on the street, no movement, no sound. The only thing that seemed to stir was the wind, which howled mournfully through the branches of the skeletal trees that lined the road, their twisted limbs reaching out like hands trying to grasp at him. The wind carried a scent that was hard to place, something acrid and metallic, but also faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. It made his stomach churn. Taking a hesitant step forward, Ethan felt an odd unease grip his heart. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the silence or the strange sense of abandonment. It was the overwhelming sense that the town itself was watching him, aware of his every move. The fog thickened, wrapping around his body like a shroud, muffling the sound of his footsteps. He pulled out the map his mother had kept in her journal, trying to find some clue, some indication of where to go next. But as he unfolded the crinkled paper, his eyes scanned it in confusion. The town was laid out in front of him, but it seemed incomplete. The streets were marked in a way that didn't make sense, leading nowhere, or sometimes doubling back on themselves. Ethan glanced up, his eyes falling on the first house at the end of the street. Its windows were dark, but the porch light flickered intermittently, casting a sickly yellow glow onto the cracked steps. It was the only house in the row that seemed to be functioning, a flicker of life in an otherwise dead town. Against his better judgment, Ethan found himself walking toward it, the map now forgotten in his hand. As he approached, he could hear something, faint at first, a soft rhythmic sound, like tapping on a wooden surface. The closer he got, the clearer it became. It wasn't coming from inside the house, though. It was coming from behind it, from the thick line of trees that bordered the property. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. The tapping grew louder, and then stopped abruptly. Then, From behind the house, a figure emerged from the fog. At first, it seemed like a shadow, shifting unnaturally against the mist. But as it drew closer, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. It was an old woman, her skin pale as death, her hair a tangled mass of white strands that hung limply around her gaunt face. Her eyes were dark pools, sunken deep into her skull, as though they had witnessed far more than they should have. The most unsettling thing about her, though, was her smile, a thin, twisted curve of lips that never reached her eyes. She stopped just in front of him, her feet not quite touching the ground, as though she were floating. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and she didn't speak for a moment, only looked at him. No, through him. "Why are you here, child?" Her voice was low and cracked, a whisper carried on the wind. "Didn't your mother warn you?" Ethan took a step back, his body tensing. He could feel the weight of her gaze pressing on him, and the fog seemed to grow thicker around them. His mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. But the moment seemed to stretch on forever, a haunting silence filling the space between them. He hesitated, trying to steady his breath. "I need to know what happened here. I need to understand why my mother—" Her smile widened, though her eyes remained void of any real emotion. "You shouldn't have come," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, her voice returned to a near whisper. "It's too late for answers. The town has claimed you. It has claimed your blood." Before Ethan could respond, she turned and shuffled back into the fog, her form slowly fading into the mist. The tapping sound resumed, growing louder as she disappeared, until it was just the hollow, rhythmic beat of his own pulse in his ears. And then, as quickly as it began, the silence returned. Ethan stood frozen, his chest tight with an overwhelming sense of dread. He didn't know what he had just witnessed, whether it was a warning or a prophecy, but he knew one thing. Whatever had happened to Willow Creek, whatever dark force lay buried here, was far worse than anything his mother had ever described. And now, it seemed to be waiting for him. The fog closed in tighter around him. There was no turning back now. Chapter 1. The first steps into the hollow. Continued. Ethan stood in the thickening fog, his breath shallow as he tried to piece together what had just happened. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. "The town has claimed you. It has claimed your blood." The weight of her chilling voice settled heavily on his chest. It felt like the air itself was tightening around him, squeezing the life out of him. He tried to shake off the panic that was creeping into his thoughts. "This is nothing," he told himself. "Just a strange woman. A local, probably. They're all a little odd here after all." But even as he thought this, the fog seemed to close in around him like a tightening noose, and his heart pounded in his ears, louder than the rhythmic tapping that still seemed to echo in the distance. He glanced around, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, but all he could see was the same decaying street, the houses lined up like tombstones, their broken windows staring out like vacant eyes. The town was silent, unnaturally so. No cars, no people walking by, not even the chirp of a distant bird. It was as though Willow Creek had been abandoned by time itself, a place frozen in a moment long past. Ethan hesitated for a moment, looking back at the house with the flickering light. It seemed so out of place in this forgotten town, like the last vestige of life amidst the ruins. But the old woman had warned him. She had said it was too late for answers. What did she mean by that? His mind raced, the unsettling feeling in his gut only deepening. It was then that he noticed something strange. In the far corner of the street, beyond the last row of houses, there was a large wrought-iron gate, partially obscured by vines and overgrown shrubs. The gate seemed to lead into an area beyond the town, perhaps the edge of the forest that bordered Willow Creek. What drew his attention wasn't the gate itself, though, but the faint flicker of light coming from within the trees, as if something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. The same feeling of unease, that weight of being watched, gripped him again, stronger this time. It wasn't the fog, it wasn't the silence, it was the gate. He couldn't explain why, but it felt wrong, like an invitation, or a trap. He felt a pull, something inside him urging him to investigate. A sense of dread held him in place, but it was countered by a strange curiosity, an overwhelming need to understand. Ethan could feel his heart racing in his chest as the urge to move grew stronger. "Don't go," a voice inside him warned. "Get in the car. Drive away. Leave this place." But his feet moved against his better judgment, and before he could stop himself, he found himself walking toward the gate. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was resisting him, pulling him back, unwilling to let him leave. The air grew colder as he approached the iron gate, and the fog seemed to thicken once more, swallowing him whole. When he reached the gate, he stopped, staring at the tangled vines that clung to it, as if nature itself had conspired to keep this place hidden. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. There was something off about the gate, something ancient, almost malevolent. He could feel it, like a pulse vibrating through the very air, something dark and hungry. The closer he got, the more his skin crawled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. What is this place? Ethan thought again, though the question seemed almost redundant. He already knew. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just any town. This wasn't just any forest. Whatever Willow Creek was, it was far from ordinary. With a deep breath, he pushed against the gate. It groaned in protest, as though reluctant to open. He winced at the sound. It was low, guttural, like the gate was alive. The air around him seemed to grow colder still, a biting chill that sank deep into his skin. The light in the trees flickered once more, and Ethan could feel his pulse quicken as he pushed the gate open just enough to slip through. The moment he crossed the threshold, the fog seemed to swallow him whole. Inside the boundary of the gate, the world felt even more distorted. The trees grew closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their limbs reaching like skeletal arms toward the sky. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making everything feel more oppressive. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, covered with a layer of rotting leaves and dirt that sank beneath his boots. As he ventured deeper into the forest, Ethan noticed the strange, creeping growths on the trees. Dark vines snaked up their trunks, twisting around the bark like serpents, their tendrils thick and dark. It wasn't just the vines. There was something else, something darker, in the air, a feeling of wrongness that seemed to radiate from the very earth beneath him. The farther he went, the darker it became. The light from the outside world, the faint, dying glow of the sun, seemed to fade into nothing, as though it were being consumed by the very shadows that clung to the trees. His steps became more tentative, as though each footfall were being watched, as though the trees themselves were waiting for him to make the wrong move. He tried to remember the map he'd seen earlier, but it felt useless here. The town had been on it, but now that he stood in the middle of the forest, it seemed as though all direction had been lost. The trees had a way of distorting his sense of space, making it impossible to tell whether he was moving forward or circling in place. A rustling sound came from somewhere deeper in the woods. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a soft sound at first, as if something, or someone, was moving just beyond the veil of the trees. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise, but all he could hear now was the pounding of his heart in his ears. Then, as he stood there, the rustling stopped. The silence returned, heavier this time, suffocating in its intensity. It felt like the air itself had paused, waiting, holding its breath. Ethan slowly turned, his gaze scanning the thick blackness between the trees. The shadows seemed to move, rippling as though something were shifting within them, something alive. And then, in the distance, he saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing faintly, like distant stars, their light piercing through the darkness. They were wide, unnaturally so, as if they belonged to something far too large to fit within the confines of the trees. Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The eyes blinked. And then it moved. Chapter 2. Beneath the Hollow. Excerpt. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as the eerie stillness of the forest pressed in from all sides. The sounds of his footsteps were muted by the thick carpet of dead leaves beneath him. But the silence that followed each step felt unnatural, a void that swallowed every other noise. The distant hum of life, the chirp of birds, the scuttle of small animals, was nowhere to be heard. It was as if this forest existed in a suspended reality, one where time itself had been stilled. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, trying to ward off the creeping chill that was settling into his bones. The air smelled of earth, of decay. Moss clung to the bark of the trees in dark patches, and the trunks themselves seemed to twist unnaturally, curling as if recoiling from some unseen force. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something behind him. The feeling of being watched hadn't subsided since he entered the forest. It was like the very trees were eyeing him, judging him with their thick, gnarled limbs. Every now and then, the faintest movement would catch his eye, but when he turned to look, nothing was there. The path seemed to narrow as he ventured deeper. It was a faint trace, a forgotten trail leading through the heart of the forest. The trees were older here, their bark dark and weathered, their roots creeping across the ground like fingers seeking purchase in the earth. Ethan couldn't help but notice the strange markings on some of the trees, scratches, lines that had been carved deep into the wood, curving like symbols he couldn't understand. Some seemed fresh, the marks still oozing sap, while others were worn and faded, nearly invisible beneath layers of moss. Maybe it's just the decay of time, Ethan thought, but even as the words passed through his mind, he didn't feel reassured. The path ended abruptly before him, and Ethan stopped, narrowing his eyes at the strange clearing in front of him. A rusted iron gate stood half open, its hinges long since broken. The gate was covered in creeping vines and moss, as though nature had slowly reclaimed it, but it had once been an entrance, an entryway to something old. He stepped forward cautiously, his footfalls slow and deliberate. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change, becoming colder, denser, heavier. The ground beneath him felt softer, as though he were walking on something that wasn't quite solid. The clearing itself was strange, barren, save for a set of stones arranged in a rough circle at its center. The stones were jagged, their surfaces weathered by time, their edges worn down by centuries of erosion. In the middle of the stone circle stood an altar, though what purpose it served was impossible to determine. It looked old, too old, and had a strange aura about it, as though the very stone itself was watching him. The ground around the altar was littered with scraps of cloth, torn, faded rags, and there were dried stains that clung to the earth, dark and stubborn. Ethan's throat tightened as he looked closer, recognizing the color of the stains. Blood, fresh but long dried. A chill ran down his spine. Something moved in the shadows. Ethan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end, a primal instinct that told him to run. But his feet were rooted to the ground, his gaze fixed on the corner of the clearing where something shifted, barely visible. It was there, just beyond the reach of his vision. Something watching him, waiting. The rustling of the trees grew louder, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something moving within the thick tangle of branches, something large. A shadow passed quickly, its outline too far from the light to make out any distinct shape. Ethan's breath hitched, and for a moment, he was unsure whether the sound had come from the trees or from within his own mind. But then, as if answering his unspoken fear, the shadow grew closer, and he saw it. A pair of eyes, yellow, glowing faintly in the dim light, their pupils wide and unblinking. The eyes did not belong to any animal he had ever seen, nor to any human. They were ancient, a deep, disturbing hue that burned with a strange intensity. They were watching him, and they were hungry. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. Excerpt. The sun had set long ago, and the darkness that wrapped itself around the town of Willow Creek was thicker than any night Ethan had ever known. There was no natural rhythm to this darkness. It felt alive, stretching, pressing against the skin like an unseen weight. His flashlight cast a thin beam through the woods, but the shadows clawed back at it, as if trying to drown the feeble light. Ethan's heart raced as he navigated the winding path, the forest around him breathing. Or was it him who was breathing too loudly? The whispers came again. They were faint at first, just a rustle on the wind, but they slowly grew clearer, sharper. No words, but something else. An intangible sensation that clawed at his mind, tugging at his thoughts. It was like the sound of voices underwater, faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from all around him. From the trees, from the earth beneath his feet, from the very air itself. "Come closer," they seemed to whisper. The words not spoken but felt. It was the pull of something ancient, something forgotten. Ethan couldn't help himself. He was drawn forward, his legs moving before he had even realized it. The whispers became more insistent, and the air seemed to grow colder, more damp. His breath formed visible puffs in the cool air, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him, though it did little to ward off the chill creeping into his bones. The path twisted and turned as if the forest itself was trying to disorient him. Ethan's eyes darted nervously from tree to tree, scanning for anything that might move. The branches of the trees above swayed even though there was no wind, bending and creaking as if they were alive, bent by the weight of something invisible. At one point, Ethan's flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and distort in impossible directions. He froze. The sound of leaves crunching beneath heavy footsteps reached his ears, coming from the depths of the forest. Someone, or something, was moving toward him, but the air was so thick with fog that he couldn't see clearly. His breath caught in his throat. He was no longer sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him, or if something truly was out there. Something from the old stories. Something that had not been seen by any living soul in years. A crack. The sound pierced the heavy silence, like a branch breaking beneath the weight of an unseen force. Ethan's pulse quickened. He was no longer alone. The whispers grew louder. A shadow passed across his beam of light. For an instant, the forest seemed to open up, revealing a glimpse of a clearing up ahead, a place where the trees grew even more twisted, their branches like fingers clawing at the dark sky. But there was something more, a shape, dark and tall, standing at the far side of the clearing. It was motionless, but Ethan could feel the gaze of it, as if it were watching him, waiting. His legs turned to lead as panic surged within him. The beam of his flashlight jittered, flickering rapidly as he moved toward the clearing, drawn by an irresistible pull. The whispers increased in volume, filling his mind with a rush of noise. "Come closer," they murmured. "See what lies beyond the veil." Ethan stumbled into the clearing, his mind swimming with thoughts that were not his own. As his foot touched the ground, he realized that the earth here was softer, more yielding, as if it were not solid but filled with something beneath, something that was pulsing with life. His foot sank slightly into the ground, as if the earth itself were alive, breathing. The figure ahead moved. For a split second, Ethan thought it might be a person, but the shape was too tall, too dark, its silhouette too inhuman. The figure was surrounded by a faint, ethereal glow, its form becoming more defined as it stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Ethan's heart stopped as a thought. No, an image flooded his mind. A vision of a woman from the town's oldest stories, was standing before him. She was beautiful in a way that was unsettling, her skin pale, her long hair black as midnight. But her eyes were pools of nothingness, deep and endless. She stared at him with an intensity that made him feel as if he were falling, being pulled into the depths of a vast, dark ocean. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. Instead, the whispers that had been swirling around him all coalesced into a single, powerful voice. "You have come too far, Ethan," it said, its voice both soft and commanding. The voice sounded like the wind through the trees, like the crackling of old leaves underfoot. But it was clear, unmistakable. You should not have come. The figure's eyes darkened, and Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. The air grew cold, unnaturally cold. Frost began to form on the ground at his feet, creeping up the legs of his pants, climbing higher with each passing second. The whispers turned into a low growl, like a storm brewing, louder, more insistent. He tried to speak, to ask who she was, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if his body was no longer his own, as if the air around him was suffocating him, choking the words from his mouth. The figure took another step forward. Her movement was slow, deliberate, but there was an unnatural fluidity to it. Too smooth, too graceful. Ethan felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but his legs refused to obey him. "You are already part of this place, Ethan," she whispered. "You have been chosen." His heart pounded in his chest. A memory, one that had been buried in his subconscious, surfaced suddenly. His grandmother's warning from years ago. Don't go into the woods. Never go too deep. There are things in those woods that are older than time itself. But it was too late. He had gone too deep, and now there was no way out. End of excerpt. Overview of Chapter 3. In this chapter, Ethan's investigation into the haunted forest and the unsettling mystery surrounding Willow Creek escalates. He moves deeper into the heart of the woods and encounters a dark force, a female entity that seems to be tied to the curse of the land. The whispers that have been haunting him become clearer, guiding him toward the truth, though a truth that might be far worse than he ever expected. The tone is oppressive, tense, and suffused with a sense of dread, as Ethan's encounter with the entity leads him to understand that he has unknowingly become a part of the forest's twisted reality. The horrors that reside within are not only waiting, they are actively seeking him. This chapter further develops the mystery surrounding the supernatural force in the forest and the dark history of Willow Creek, setting up the intense confrontation and realization that will unfold in the coming chapters. Ethan is no longer just a curious outsider. He is now deeply entwined in the malevolent force that haunts the land. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark. Part 2. The figure in the clearing. The forest had gone completely silent. Not even the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was as though the very air had been held captive, suspended in an eerie stillness that pressed down on Ethan like a physical weight. The fog had thickened, curling inwards, wrapping itself around his legs, until his movements became sluggish and labored. The ground beneath him had softened, as if the earth itself were breathing, pulsing with some strange energy that made him want to look away, but he couldn't. His gaze remained locked on the figure in the clearing. The woman, if she could be called that, moved closer, her dark silhouette becoming more distinct as she approached. Her eyes were the first thing that caught his attention. They gleamed with an unnatural light, pupils dilated and too large, so deep that it felt like staring into the void. And yet, they were impossibly beautiful, ethereal, hollow, yet somehow alive with an unsettling intensity that twisted his insides. "You should not have come," she whispered again, her voice like wind through dead leaves, soft and dangerous. It was not the kind of warning a person would give. It was a command, a truth etched into the very fabric of the air. Ethan's mouth went dry. He tried to speak, to force some response, but his tongue was thick with fear, his breath shallow. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but his limbs were frozen in place, as if the ground had taken root inside of him, holding him here against his will. Every muscle in his body screamed to flee, yet his feet refused to move. She took another step toward him, her figure growing taller with each stride, until she was so close he could feel the weight of her gaze pressing down on him. There was no sound, no footsteps. She didn't walk like a human. She glided. Her feet never seemed to touch the ground, her movements smooth, liquid-like, as though she were not bound by the same laws that governed everything else. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. The woman's eyes bored into his soul, stripping away any illusion of safety or security that he had left. "I am the keeper," she said, her voice now layered with something ancient and old as time itself. "The keeper of secrets." The words settled over him like a heavy shroud. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand, but the way she spoke, the calm finality in her tone, sent a tremor through his chest. The keeper of secrets. Ethan's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of forgotten stories he had heard as a child, his grandmother's warnings, the townsfolk's hushed whispers about the forest, how it was cursed, how no one dared to venture too deep into the woods after dark. But none of it made sense now, not in the way it should. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard those tales. They were distant memories, faded like old photographs. "What do you want?" His voice cracked as he finally forced out the words. The tremor in his voice sounded weak, foreign. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. It was not a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile one might give when about to reveal something long buried, something unspeakable. "You've come to know," she murmured, "but what you seek is not meant for you." Her fingers, long, pale, and slender like tree branches, extended towards him, slow and deliberate. His breath hitched, panic rising in his chest. She wasn't touching him, but the air around her hand crackled, buzzing with an energy that sent a cold shiver through his veins. The world seemed to tilt slightly, and Ethan felt a strange pressure build around his head, pressing inward as though something were pushing against his skull. His vision blurred, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to warp. The trees bent unnaturally, their trunks twisting and stretching like the limbs of creatures too old to be alive. "Do you understand now, Ethan?" The voice was softer now, almost a hum, like an old lullaby sung by the wind. "Do you feel it? The pull of the forest? The weight of its forgotten history?" Ethan's chest tightened. It was as if the very forest had come alive around him, the trees watching, the ground shifting beneath his feet. The fog swirled like a living thing, and his feet sank deeper into the soft earth. He could hear the whispers again, more urgent this time, more insistent, curling around him like invisible vines. "Come closer," they beckoned. "Look deeper." "You belong to this place now," she continued, her voice a serpent's hiss, yet strangely sweet. "You have always belonged." Ethan shook his head, his hands trembling as he reached out to steady himself against a nearby tree. The bark was slick under his fingers, as if coated in something wet and unnatural. His thoughts were clouded, muddled by the strange sensations creeping through his body. The woman's words felt like a curse, an old and ancient truth he had never been meant to know. "Why me?" he managed to ask, though it sounded like a foolish question even as he spoke it. The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp to be human. "You chose this path. You came here." The whispers around him grew louder, rising to a crescendo of overlapping voices, all speaking at once. "Chosen, chosen, chosen." It was a chant now, a constant rhythm that thrummed through the very fabric of the air. Ethan's head spun, and he staggered backward, the words, "No, no, no," slipping from his lips in a panic. But it was as if his body had betrayed him. His feet were stuck, anchored to the earth that seemed to pulse beneath him, growing heavier with each passing second. The woman stepped forward, her cold eyes never leaving his. "The keeper has spoken," she whispered. "It is done." In the blink of an eye, she was gone. One moment, she was there, looming over him, her eyes staring into his very soul, and the next, she vanished into the mist, as though she had never been. The whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake, but the air still felt thick, oppressive. Ethan stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Something had changed. He could feel it in his bones. The forest was no longer the same. The whispering, the figure, the darkness. It was all too real. He could no longer deny it. The curse was not just a tale. It was a reality. Ethan stumbled backward, his legs weak beneath him, his thoughts muddled and scattered. His chest heaved with each breath, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt again, the trees around him spinning as if caught in the grip of some unseen force. He had to leave. He had to get out. But the path back, the way he had come, was gone. The forest had swallowed him whole. Chapter 4. Beneath the surface. The night deepened as Ethan walked through the dense trees of Willow Creek, the fog thickening with each step, as if the forest itself were swallowing him whole. The mist clung to his skin like a wet shroud, and the cold seeped deep into his bones. The whispers were still there, faint, like a distant melody sung by something ancient, but now they were joined by something else, the feeling of being watched. He'd been walking for hours, though he wasn't sure how long. Time had become distorted in the woods, a strange labyrinth that seemed to have no end. The trees had shifted, their trunks bending and twisting unnaturally, and every path he tried to take led him deeper into the dark heart of the forest. There was no clear path, no sign of civilization. Only the gnawing sensation that he was moving in circles, trapped in a place that existed outside of time and reason. His feet had begun to ache, his legs heavy, as though each step he took drained a little more of his strength. The exhaustion was maddening, but even worse was the knowledge that he was being followed. The feeling of eyes on him was constant, like invisible fingers brushing across the back of his neck, sending shivers down his spine. Every now and then he would turn, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the mist. But no matter how quickly he spun around, there was nothing but the trees, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal hands. But the forest wasn't empty. He knew it. He could feel it in the very air around him, in the way the branches seemed to creak and groan, as though they were whispering in a language he couldn't understand. There had been something in the clearing. The woman, the keeper. Her face, pale and unearthly, had imprinted itself on his mind, burned into his memory like a brand. The way her eyes glowed, her voice wrapping around him like a slow-burning fire. She had told him he belonged to this place now. But what did that even mean? How could he belong to a place like this? A place that felt alive in a way that no land should. A place that seemed to be watching him. He was beginning to lose track of time. His thoughts had become disjointed. His mind clouded with strange dreams and fragmented memories of things he couldn't explain. Each step he took felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling him deeper into its grip. The further he went, the less he remembered who he was before he had arrived in Willow Creek. His name, his life, the people he had known, they all felt distant, like echoes of a forgotten dream. Then he saw it. A small clearing ahead, a break in the dense trees. It was faint, but there was something about it that drew him in, as if the clearing itself was calling to him. He hesitated for only a moment before he pushed forward, his feet dragging through the thick fog until he reached the edge. The sight before him made his stomach twist. The clearing was empty, save for a large blackened stone at the center. The stone was weathered and ancient, its surface etched with strange symbols and markings that seemed to writhe in the moonlight, shifting and changing as though they were alive. The air around it hummed with a low, resonant vibration, like the sound of a heartbeat, slow and steady, but unmistakably there. Ethan's breath hitched as he stepped closer. He reached out, his fingers grazing the surface of the stone, and as he touched it, a sudden surge of energy shot through his body. A vision exploded in his mind. The forest around him shifted, the trees bent and twisted, their bark peeling away to reveal the gnarled roots beneath, like the veins of some massive living creature. The sky darkened, clouds swirling in violent patterns, casting long shadows across the land. Ethan saw flashes of strange figures, humanoid but not quite human, moving through the trees. Their faces were obscured, hidden behind masks of shadow and smoke, but their eyes glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. The vision disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving Ethan gasping for air, his heart racing in his chest. He pulled his hand back from the stone, his fingers trembling. The hum from the stone still lingered in the air, vibrating through his bones. What was that? The ground beneath him began to tremble. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the earth, as though the forest itself were awakening, groaning with some ancient force. The air turned heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. His mouth went dry. It was blood. A crack appeared in the stone, running from one side to the other, as if it had been struck by some unseen force. The symbols on the stone began to glow, pulsating with an otherworldly light, casting long shadows across the clearing. Ethan stepped back, his legs unsteady. He had to leave. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't... Something moved. A figure stepped from the shadows, its form barely visible at first, but slowly coming into focus. The same dark figure from before, the keeper, her eyes locked onto his, glowing like burning embers, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. You felt it, didn't you? Her voice was a whisper, but it carried through the air with the weight of 1,000 years. It echoed in his skull, reverberating through his entire body. Ethan couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only stare at her, his breath shallow as she stepped forward, her feet making no sound on the ground. "You've touched it now," she continued, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "The heart of Willow Creek, the blood that runs through its veins. The stone was the key, Ethan. You unlocked it." He shook his head, trying to back away, but his legs wouldn't respond. His body was frozen, as though the forest itself had claimed him. "No," he managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to. I didn't—" The keeper's smile widened. "It's too late. You are part of it now. And the forest never forgets." Her eyes glowed brighter, blinding him. And in that instant, Ethan felt a presence behind him, an oppressive weight, as if the trees themselves were closing in around him, pushing him toward the stone. The hum grew louder, a deafening sound that vibrated through his skull, and Ethan knew, without a doubt, that he was no longer alone in the woods. The dark figures, the ones from his vision, began to emerge from the shadows, their faces still hidden in the darkness. They were moving toward him. They were coming to claim him. Ethan's heart raced, a cold sweat slick on his skin. He had to run. He had to. But his feet wouldn't move. His breath became shallow, his vision starting to blur as the world around him seemed to collapse, folding in on itself. The keeper's eyes were the last thing he saw before everything went dark. Chapter 4, Beneath the Surface, Part 2. Ethan's eyes snapped open, but what greeted him was not the clearing, nor the stone, nor the keeper. Instead, there was darkness, total and suffocating. His body felt heavy, his muscles sore as if they had been stretched beyond their limits. A cold sweat clung to his skin, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He was lying down, but the ground was soft, too soft, like wet earth, as though he had been submerged in something alive. His hands trembled as he reached out, feeling the air around him. The scent of decay, of earth, rotting wood, and stagnant water was thick in the air. Where was he? Ethan tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't respond. His mind screamed for him to move, but the terror had dulled his senses. It was as though he were trapped inside his own body, imprisoned by an unseen force. Panic surged through him as he realized that the darkness he was in wasn't just the absence of light. It was something more. It was as if the world itself had closed in around him, pulling him into some suffocating void. A whisper, distant at first, then louder. It was a voice, low and hoarse, like a croak, but familiar in a way that made his stomach turn. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's heart raced. The words came from everywhere, 1,000 voices woven together into one, echoing in the pit of his mind. He forced himself to sit up, his hands shaking as they pushed against the damp earth. He was in a cave or something like it, a hollow, darkened space that seemed to pulse with a sickly energy. The walls were slick, as if they were sweating, the moisture creeping up from the ground and into the air. The air felt thick, almost as if it had substance, like the very atmosphere was alive. The voice came again, closer this time, and Ethan spun around, his breath hitching in his throat. He could feel the presence now, something looming just beyond his vision. But when he turned, all he saw was darkness. "You've unlocked it, haven't you?" the voice hissed. It was closer now, almost behind him, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "You've disturbed it." Ethan's breath caught. The keeper. He had touched the stone, and now he understood. The stone had been a portal, a key that had opened the door to something ancient and unfathomable, something that had been waiting, perhaps for centuries, for someone like him to come along. The whispers, the visions, the strange sensations, they weren't just random, they were warnings. The forest was alive and it was hungry. "Please," Ethan whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was begging. "Please, I didn't mean to." "You cannot leave now," the voice interrupted, cold and unyielding. "You are part of it. You are part of Willow Creek." A wave of nausea crashed over him. his stomach twisting. He could feel it. He could feel the earth shifting beneath him, as though it were breathing. Something was in the ground, something that was slowly, inevitably rising. The pulsating energy in the cave grew stronger, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on him, their surfaces undulating like the skin of some massive creature, breathing in sync with the forest outside. Ethan stumbled to his feet, his body moving on instinct, but his mind was unraveling, a thin thread of sanity fraying with each passing second. He had to escape. He had to find his way out of this nightmare. But where was the way out? The mist had followed him into the cave, seeping in through cracks in the walls, curling around his ankles like tendrils, pulling him deeper into the earth. The cave was alive, a part of the forest's vast, endless web, and he was a mere thread in its tangled, ever-growing mass. The whispers were louder now, deafening, and they seemed to come from everywhere at once. The very air was thick with them, a chorus of voices, each one tinged with malice. "You'll never escape," they chanted. "You'll never escape Willow Creek." A cold laugh echoed from the shadows. Ethan whipped around, but no one was there. The cavern was empty, save for the suffocating fog and the oppressive feeling that someone, was watching him from the unseen depths of the cave. Suddenly, the stone he had touched earlier appeared before him, floating in the air, its surface glowing with a faint, eerie light. The symbols on it, those twisting, writhing markings, had become clearer now. They were no longer just patterns. They were something more. Faces, eyes that blinked, shifted, stared back at him with an unnatural, malevolent intelligence. The hum returned, louder now, a deep vibration that rattled his teeth. He reached out, almost against his will, his hand hovering above the stone, drawn to it like a magnet, but something stopped him. A figure stepped into the clearing, its form emerging from the darkness like a shadow in the fog. It was tall, too tall. Its silhouette bent in a way that defied nature. The mist around it seemed to twist and coil, as though it were a part of the thing itself. Its face was obscured, hidden behind a veil of shifting darkness, but the eyes, those eyes, glowed. They burned with an unnatural fire, filling the cavern with a sickly yellow light. "You should have listened," the figure whispered, its voice like sandpaper scraping against bone. "Now you are one of us." Ethan's blood ran cold. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but his body refused to move. His legs were frozen, his feet glued to the ground. The weight of the air around him felt like a physical presence, holding him in place. The figure advanced slowly, its movements deliberate, as if savoring every step. "Do you hear it?" the figure asked, its voice a hollow echo in the stillness. "The forest calls, the stone calls, and now, so do you." The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing the stone. The moment its skin made contact, the entire cavern trembled, a violent shudder that ran through the walls like a scream. The ground cracked open beneath Ethan's feet, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. His breath was shallow, his chest constricting as though the very air was suffocating him. The forest was alive. It wasn't just the trees or the earth. It was something deeper, something older. The stone was part of it, and now so was he. The figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes never leaving his face. "You are one with Willow Creek now," it whispered, "and there is no escaping it." A scream tore from Ethan's throat, but it was swallowed by the darkness. The ground beneath him was moving, shifting, and he realized, too late, that he was sinking into it, pulled into the heart of the forest. The stone pulsed, its light growing brighter, and the voices of the forest, no longer distant whispers, roared in his ears. And then, everything went black. Chapter 5. The silence within. The blackness swallowed him whole. Ethan's chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, but the air seemed thick, as if it were being weighed down by an invisible force. His mind was a swirl of confusion, a tangle of images, sounds and voices that didn't make sense. A constant hum, like the beating of an enormous heart, reverberated through his skull, and all he could do was clutch his head and try to block it out. "Where am I?" It felt as though he were floating, suspended in some vast, endless void. He reached out into the darkness, his fingers brushing against something, wet, cold, and rough. It felt like stone. His heart skipped a beat. The stone. The moment his fingertips made contact, a rush of memories flooded his mind. The clearing. The figure. The stone glowing with those ominous symbols. The deep, relentless hum that seemed to echo from the earth itself. The voice. You are one with Willow Creek now. He had heard it, hadn't he? He had felt it. A chill crept down his spine. He could still feel it. Still feel the pull of that voice, drawing him deeper into this nightmare. He couldn't remember how long he had been unconscious, but the ache in his muscles told him it had been a while. He was stiff, his limbs heavy and unresponsive, as though they were being held down by an unseen weight. Then, something shifted in the dark and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There was movement. A rustling sound, faint at first, but growing louder. The air around him seemed to stir, a chill brushing past him like a breath. He tried to sit up, but the ground beneath him shifted, and he felt his body sinking deeper. Panicking, he tried to move, but it was as if his body had grown heavy, too heavy to lift. His arms were paralyzed, his legs unresponsive. "Help!" he whispered hoarsely, though the words seemed weak, desperate. He couldn't even be sure if anyone was around. The sound of the rustling grew louder, and the air seemed to grow thicker, as though the very world was pressing down on him. A voice, a whisper, came to him again. "You're not alone." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. It wasn't the same voice as before, but it was close. Too close. It was almost inside his head, in the very marrow of his bones. "Who's there?" Ethan croaked, but his voice sounded foreign to him, distant, cracked. There was no answer. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the depths of the darkness. At first, it seemed like a silhouette, but as it drew closer, Ethan could make out more detail. Dark, ragged clothing, long, matted hair, and glowing eyes that pierced through the blackness like lanterns. The figure's face was pale, too pale, almost inhuman. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat as it stepped closer. There was something wrong with it. Its movements were jerky, twitching unnaturally, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The skin on its face seemed to ripple, as though it were being stretched over bones that didn't quite fit. Its eyes, glowing faintly, never left him. You're not from here," it rasped, its voice like nails scraping across stone. "But you will be soon." Ethan's heart pounded. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was trapped, caught in the grip of something he couldn't understand, something ancient and unfathomable. The figure leaned forward, its mouth opening slowly, revealing teeth that were far too sharp to be human. "Willow Creek calls to you," it hissed. "The forest has claimed you, just like the others. Just like the ones before you." Ethan's throat tightened, his eyes widening with panic. "The others?" His voice cracked. "What do you mean? What happened to them?" The figure's grin widened, showing more of its unnaturally sharp teeth. It stepped closer, and Ethan could smell it now. The stench of decay, of rot, of something old and sick. The air around him grew heavier, as if the very ground was sinking into the earth. "You've already met them," the figure rasped, its voice full of mockery. "They're the ones you've heard in your head, the ones you've seen in your dreams, the ones whose whispers you hear every night. They are part of Willow Creek now, just as you will be." Ethan's blood ran cold. He hadn't just been hearing things. He wasn't going crazy. "You're lying," Ethan spat, though his voice trembled. "I won't become like them." The figure's smile faded, its eyes flickering with something. Anger, or perhaps something worse. The air around Ethan seemed to crackle with energy, like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. "Lying?" The figure chuckled, its voice low and dark. "No, Ethan, the truth is already inside you. You just don't know it yet. You'll understand soon enough." The figure stepped back, disappearing into the darkness just as quickly as it had come, leaving Ethan alone once again. He gasped, struggling to sit up, but his body still wouldn't respond. His head spun with confusion, and he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The whispers, the figures, the dark, suffocating pull of Willow Creek. "You won't leave," the voice whispered again, this time so close that Ethan felt as if it was inside his own mind. "Not now. Not after everything you've seen." Ethan closed his eyes, shaking. He could hear the voices, so many voices, overlapping in his head. Some were familiar, others alien, but they all shared the same dreadful undertone. Fear, anger, desperation. He opened his eyes and gasped in shock. The stone was back. It lay just a few feet away, glowing faintly, its symbols now moving, shifting, like they were alive. And with it, the ground around him seemed to change, the very earth beneath his hands trembling with energy. The mist from earlier returned, creeping up from the ground, swirling around him like a living thing. Ethan felt the weight of the stone's presence pressing against his mind, as if it was calling to him, beckoning him closer. The figures, the voices, they were all connected. The forest, the stone, Willow Creek. He could no longer deny it. He was a part of it. The stone's glow intensified, and with it, a deep, unsettling voice echoed in his mind. "You belong to the forest now." Ethan's blood ran cold as the words settled over him like a shroud. He had already crossed a line. The forest had already claimed him. And there was no turning back. Chapter 6. The Echoes of Willow Creek. The whispers never ceased. Ethan awoke again in the darkness, his senses tingling with an acute awareness of something lurking just beyond the veil of his perception. His chest was tight, as though an invisible hand were slowly squeezing the life out of him. The coldness seeped into his skin, and the world around him seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a low hum vibrating through the very air. He hadn't expected to wake up. He didn't know if he even wanted to anymore. His body ached from the strain, and his head was a storm of conflicting thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, the shadow of Willow Creek stretched deeper into his mind, suffocating him. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a consciousness that had long existed, hidden beneath layers of time and earth. His thoughts were disrupted by a sound, a rustle in the distance. At first, it was subtle, a mere shifting of leaves, but it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. His breath caught in his throat as the sound grew louder, followed by a low, guttural growl, not quite animal, but distinctly wrong. It reverberated through the ground beneath him. The whispers intensified. "Ethan." The voice was faint at first, like a breath on the wind, but as it echoed through his mind, it became clearer, more defined. It was calling him, beckoning him toward something, toward the heart of the forest. He knew this voice. He had heard it in the deepest corners of his mind, in the dreams that invaded his nights, but now it felt real, so real. "Come to us." The sound of footsteps, or perhaps something worse, took over. Ethan's body trembled uncontrollably. He wasn't sure if he wanted to look, or if he wanted to stay still, hoping that whatever it was would just pass. But curiosity tugged at him, gnawing at him like a hunger he couldn't ignore. Against his better judgment, he lifted his head and slowly opened his eyes. The forest was no longer the comforting, familiar place it once was. It had morphed into something ancient. The trees were twisted, their bark now dark and slick, reflecting a sheen that was not natural. The air was thick with fog, the mist swirling in unnatural patterns. The ground beneath him was soft, like a rotting carpet of leaves and moss, and it squelched as he shifted his weight. "Ethan, you have come. You are ours now." He turned his head toward the voice. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, hidden in the mist. Its shape was blurry at first, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight, but then it began to take form, materializing from the shadows like some grotesque manifestation. Long, spindly limbs extended from its body, and its face, if you could call it a face, was a haunting mask of features too distorted to understand. Its eyes were hollow, black holes that seemed to swallow the light around them. The air around him grew colder as the figure took another step forward, its form flickering in and out of existence like a poorly maintained projection. Ethan's body froze, his instincts screaming at him to run, to escape. But he couldn't move. He couldn't tear his gaze away from it. There was something about the figure, something that held him in place like an unbreakable spell. "You are part of us now," the voice continued. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, all overlapping and blending together in a maddening cacophony. Some were high-pitched, others low and growling, but they all carried the same message. "You are ours." Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. His throat was dry, his tongue thick with fear. His eyes stung, his vision blurring, but he could still see it. Still see the figure standing there, the way it twisted and shimmered with the flickering of unnatural light. "You are the next one," the figure whispered. "The forest, the ancient spirit of Willow Creek. It claims you." The words seemed to reverberate within his skull, echoing through his mind, burrowing deep into his consciousness. "The forest claims you." The phrase sent a shock of cold terror racing through him, as though he could already feel the earth beneath him sinking into a grave. He tried again to scream, but the sound of his voice was swallowed by the thick air, drowned by the overwhelming power of the presence that surrounded him. It was as if the very world had conspired to silence him, to render him mute to the horrors unfolding before him. With a sudden, jolting movement, the figure advanced, its limbs stretched unnaturally, disjointed in a way that defied physics, but there was no escaping it. The figure closed the distance between them in an instant, and before Ethan could even process the action, it was standing right beside him. A cold hand touched his shoulder, icy fingers that seemed to burn through his flesh, sinking into his skin like ice-cold claws. The touch paralyzed him, and the whispers grew louder, deafening. "You were always meant to join us." Ethan could feel the weight of its words, like the crushing weight of the earth pressing down on him. The spirits of Willow Creek, the ones he had heard in his dreams, the ones who had haunted his waking hours, were here, in the form of this wretched thing. They were the very essence of the forest, and they had claimed him. The figure's eyes, those endless, bottomless pits, locked onto his, and for the briefest moment, Ethan saw something he couldn't fully comprehend. A flash of faces, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. "No!" The thoughts scrambled in his mind, but before he could react, the figure leaned in close, its grotesque face hovering just inches from his. "Your soul will be the last piece," it said softly, the words slipping into his mind like poison. "You will become one of us." Chapter 7. The Abyss That Calls. The air in Willow Creek felt heavier now, thick with something far worse than just the smell of rot and decay. Ethan's skin prickled with a constant chill, the kind that made every hair stand on end. He could feel eyes on him, even when no one was around, not human eyes. Something else. Something ancient. Every night as the moonlight filtered through the trees, he could hear whispers from the forest, from the ground beneath him, calling him deeper into its darkened heart. Ethan knew he was being watched, but he didn't know by what. He stumbled through the woods, each step heavier than the last. The further he walked, the more his legs seemed to betray him. His head felt light, his thoughts fractured, like pieces of a shattered mirror scattering in the wind. Sometimes, in his peripheral vision, he saw the trees bending in ways they shouldn't have been able to, twisting toward him like skeletal hands reaching for his soul. It had been days since he first encountered the figure, the one with the hollow eyes, the one who told him he was part of the forest now. Ethan had tried to leave since that night. He had tried to run, to flee this godforsaken place. But each time, the forest itself seemed to turn him back, pushing him deeper into its ever-expanding embrace. It was as if the land knew him, as if it had been waiting for him, and now it wouldn't let him go. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he walked, the trees, those damn ancient trees, always led him back to the same place, the same clearing, the same spot where the figure had first whispered his name. He couldn't escape. Ethan collapsed against a gnarled oak, the bark rough against his trembling hand. The whispers continued, louder now, overlapping in a dissonant chorus that filled his mind. The voices twisted in strange, unnatural patterns, as though speaking a language from before time itself. They spoke in tones that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Each word a command, a warning, a taunt. He pulled his knees to his chest, his mind swirling in an unbearable vortex of fear. Every sound, every movement in the woods seemed to mock him, like the forest itself was alive, breathing, watching. "Ethan!" The voice was familiar now. The same hollow echo he had heard before, the same one that had haunted his thoughts. It was always there, a presence just beyond his reach, like a shadow cast by the darkest part of his soul. "Come to us," the voice continued, now a little more insistent, a little more commanding. Ethan tried to block it out, to force himself to ignore the call, but it was impossible. His body moved on its own, as though some unseen force had taken control. He stood up, his legs stiff, his eyes wide with terror, yet somehow unable to turn away. The trees around him seemed to close in, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out, urging him forward. With each step, the voices grew louder, their words coiling around him like ropes of smoke, suffocating him. "Ethan, come closer." His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm like the ticking of a clock, counting down to an inevitable end. He tried to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his throat burning, and his vision blurred as though he were looking through a fogged window. Ahead, through the haze, a shape materialized. It was there, at the edge of the clearing, standing tall, watching him. A figure shrouded in shadows, its features indistinct, flickering like a broken image. It was the same one from his nightmares, the same one from before. But now, there was something different about it. The figure moved closer, its form becoming more defined with every step it took toward him. It was as if the darkness itself was crawling over it, draping it in a cloak of shadows. Ethan felt a coldness fill the air, colder than he had ever known, seeping deep into his bones. It felt as if the very air was sucking out his warmth, leaving him frozen in place. The voice came again, this time closer, inside his skull, inside his soul. "You belong here, Ethan." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating with an unnatural power, shaking him to the core. His body began to tremble uncontrollably, his eyes wide in panic as he stared at the figure that loomed before him. "Willow Creek has claimed you," it said, the words coming in a rush, like a tidal wave crashing against his senses. "You are no longer human. You are one of us now. You are a part of the forest, a part of the earth that sleeps beneath this land." Ethan felt his stomach churn, his mind spinning as the figure reached out toward him. Its hands, long, twisted and clawed, reached for his face, and he could feel the cold touch of its fingers brushing against his skin. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You have been chosen." The last thing he saw before his vision went black was the figure's eyes, those deep, empty pits, staring back at him, watching him fall into the void. He woke up with a start, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. His heart raced in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The world around him was dark, the trees looming overhead like towering giants, their twisted forms blending into the night. Ethan's mind was still foggy, his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, like it no longer belonged to him. His limbs were stiff, his hands trembling as he pushed himself off the ground. The whispers were still there, a constant hum in the back of his mind, urging him forward, urging him deeper into the forest. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the smell of something ancient and dead. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he slowly looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The clearing was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of trees and shadows. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, as though the earth itself had been hollowed out. And then he saw it, a figure, standing in the distance, watching. It was the same figure, but this time it was different, more solid, more real. Ethan's pulse quickened. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as though he were rooted to the spot, unable to break free. The figure moved closer, its long limbs stretching unnaturally as it glided through the forest like a spectre. The whispers grew louder until they were deafening. A cacophony of voices, all demanding his attention, all calling him by name. Ethan, come closer. He opened his mouth to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by the suffocating darkness that surrounded him. The figure was nearly upon him now. Its face was twisted, a grotesque mask of features, half human, half something else entirely. Its eyes, those endless black pits, bored into his soul. And then, with a voice that was both a command and a curse, it spoke. You are ours, Ethan, forever. Chapter 8. The Awakening. Ethan had lost all sense of time. Was it day? Was it night? The once clear distinction between hours and minutes had crumbled under the weight of his endless disorientation. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an unending maze of gnarled trees that loomed like the twisted limbs of some ancient beast. The air hung thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional whisper of the wind or the sharp rustle of leaves. But even the wind had become an oppressive force here, not a comforting breath of nature, but a sharp, cold sigh that seemed to carry secrets, dark secrets, from beyond the world. Every step Ethan took felt heavier than the last. His limbs felt foreign, as if they were no longer his own. The ground beneath him was soft, like walking through thick mud, and with each step he could feel it sucking at his feet, pulling him deeper into the earth. No, he whispered to himself, but even his voice felt alien. His words were swallowed by the vastness of the forest, dissipating into the cold air. His heart pounded in his chest as he forced himself to keep moving, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to stop. The figure, the one with the hollow eyes, was never far behind. He could feel it in his bones, that it was watching him, lurking just beyond his field of vision. The fear was suffocating, relentless. The whispers were louder now, impossibly close, filling his ears with a maddening chorus of unintelligible words. Come closer, Ethan, they crooned. The words were like fingers, wrapping around his mind, pulling him toward them. They urged him deeper into the forest, deeper into the maze that seemed to shift and change with every turn he took. He no longer recognized the path he had been on. The landscape around him was distorted, unnatural. The trees were too tall, too thick. The branches stretched out like hands, reaching for him, scratching at the sky. His breath quickened, his pulse raced. He had to find a way out. But then, the trees parted, and he saw it. The clearing. It was the same one, the same place where he had seen the figure before, but now something was different. The air felt charged, as if it were alive, pulsing with some dark energy. The earth beneath him seemed to tremble, and the wind, now a furious gale, howled through the branches. The clearing was no longer empty. There was something there. Someone. The figure stood in the center of the clearing, its form shrouded in shadow, its features as indistinct as before. But now, there was a presence that radiated from it, a malevolent energy that crackled in the air, vibrating through Ethan's skin like static. His heart thudded in his chest, an echo of something primal, something ancient. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. You should never have come here, the figure said, its voice cold and hollow, like the sound of wind through an abandoned house. Ethan tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His mouth felt dry, his tongue like sandpaper. He tried to back away, but his feet were rooted to the ground, as if the earth had claimed him. The figure took a step forward. Its movement was slow, deliberate, and yet the distance between them closed in an instant, as though the world itself had bent to its will. The figure's presence was overwhelming now, pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. You belong to this place now, the figure continued, its voice like a whisper in his ear, though it wasn't really speaking to him at all. It was speaking through him, inside him. You are part of Willow Creek. You will never leave. Ethan's chest tightened. He struggled to breathe, as if the very air were being stolen from his lungs. His thoughts were scattering, like leaves in the wind. and he felt something sharp, something cold, like claws digging into his mind. "No, I can't," he gasped, his voice trembling. "You can't escape," the figure said, its tone final, as if the decision had already been made. "You are bound here, Ethan. This is your home now. This is where you will remain, forever." With every word, Ethan felt something inside of him crumble. His heart, his very soul, ached with the weight of those words. The thought of never seeing daylight again, never escaping the oppressive darkness of the forest consumed him. But something inside of him resisted. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Ethan's eyes darted around the clearing, and that's when he saw it. The edge of the woods, the shadows gathering like something tangible, something real. A path, perhaps, or a trick of his mind. He couldn't tell. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw a way forward. With a burst of willpower, he tore himself from the ground, the forest fighting against him, the trees reaching for him as he ran. His feet pounded against the earth, his breath ragged in his throat. The whispers followed him, closing in from all sides, but this time, they didn't paralyze him. He was free. He thought he could hear the figure's voice behind him, but it was distant, fading. He pushed harder, ignoring the pain in his legs, the burning in his chest. And then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, he saw light. Not the soft, comforting glow of daylight, but something more primal. A flickering golden light, like a lantern in the distance. It was faint, but it was real. And it beckoned him. Ethan's heart soared. He ran toward it with everything he had left. The trees began to thin, the shadows receding, and for the first time since he had arrived in Willow Creek, he felt a shred of hope. But as he reached the light, he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't a lantern. It was a door. A tall, weathered door that stood in the middle of the clearing, alone, without a wall or a house. The wood was dark and cracked, and it exuded a sense of foreboding, like it was never meant to be there. A single symbol was carved into the surface, a twisted knot, its meaning lost to time. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound he had ever heard. He stood before the door, staring at the symbol, feeling an invisible pull toward it, urging him to open it. Was this the way out, or was it yet another trap? He didn't know, but he had no choice. With trembling hands, he reached for the handle, the metal cold beneath his touch. The moment his fingers brushed it, he felt a jolt of energy surge through his body, like a current of electricity shooting through his veins. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a blinding light within. Ethan hesitated, his heart racing in his chest. He could hear his own breath, ragged and desperate as the light beckoned. For one fleeting moment, he wondered if this was it, if this was the moment where everything would end, where Willow Creek would claim him forever. But then, with a force he couldn't resist, he stepped into the light. Chapter 8. Part 2. The light beyond the door was blinding. Ethan's vision was washed out, like looking into the sun, but there was no warmth, no solace in its glow. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around and run, but his body betrayed him. He stepped forward, drawn to the light with an undeniable force, as though some unseen hand had seized him and was dragging him toward an inevitable fate. The door slammed shut behind him. He couldn't remember crossing the threshold, but there he was, on the other side. The air was different here. He could feel it, the density, the weight of it pressing against him from all sides. It was cold. Not just the kind of cold that sent a shiver down your spine, but the cold that settled into your bones, that made you feel as if your very soul were being frozen. The light, so blinding moments ago, now felt like it was coming from all directions, spilling through cracks in the walls, filling the space with an ethereal glow that distorted everything in its path. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, a primal beat that reverberated through the silence. He was alone, or at least, he thought he was. He took a hesitant step forward, his breath shallow, each movement uncertain. The ground beneath his feet was smooth, almost glass-like, and he wondered if he was still inside the forest, or if he had crossed into something altogether different. The air was thick with a strange oppressive energy that wrapped around him like a tightening coil. It felt wrong, not just wrong, but unnatural, like a place that was never meant to be seen, a place that shouldn't exist. Ethan turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of his surroundings. But everything was wrong. There were no walls, no ceiling, only endless light, a pulsing, sickly glow that didn't seem to come from any identifiable source. The ground beneath his feet seemed to stretch on forever, vanishing into the distance, with no end in sight. And the silence, the oppressive silence, was almost deafening, pressing in from all sides, as if the very air had swallowed all sound. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was no sound, not even the breath he inhaled, only the pounding of his heart and the pulse of the eerie light that surrounded him. Suddenly he felt it, something cold brushing against his cheek. He froze, his body rigid with fear. It was too soft to be the wind, too deliberate to be anything natural. The air shifted around him. The silence was broken, but it wasn't by his voice. A whisper, like a faint sigh, rippled through the air. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was calling his name. Ethan. He jerked back, his heart skipping a beat. His breath caught in his throat, but he couldn't move. He could feel something pulling at him, an invisible force, urging him to step forward. Ethan, come closer. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was louder, more insistent. It was no longer an invitation. It was a demand. He took a step forward against his will, his body moving in spite of his terror. The light pulsed, flickering, and the temperature dropped even further. He could see his breath now, rising in mist before his face. His pulse raced. He wanted to stop. He wanted to scream, to turn around and run, but his legs were moving of their own accord, dragging him deeper into the light. A figure appeared in the distance. At first, it was a mere shadow, indistinct, shifting in the haze. But as Ethan drew closer, it became clearer, more defined. A silhouette of a woman, tall and thin, her form draped in flowing white robes. Her hair was long and dark, cascading down her back like liquid shadows. Her eyes, though, were the most unsettling. Black as the void, with no whites or pupils, only endless darkness. Her face was expressionless, but her presence was all-consuming. Ethan tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His throat felt tight, as if something were squeezing it from the inside. "Who are you?" he managed to croak, his voice barely a whisper in the stifling silence. The woman tilted her head slightly, as though considering him. Her lips parted, and the air grew colder still. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, a feeling of dread creeping into every fiber of his being. "I am the keeper of this place." Her voice was melodic but hollow, like the sound of wind chimes drifting through a desolate graveyard. It was not a voice that belonged to the living. It echoed in his mind, reverberating in his skull like an unending hum. "The keeper of what?" Ethan gasped, taking an instinctive step back. But the woman did not move. She remained still, her eyes never leaving him. The sense of her presence felt like it was closing in on him, becoming more oppressive with every breath he took. "You have entered the land of forgotten things, Ethan." The words struck him like a blow. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend what she was saying. The land of forgotten things. What did that mean? "Here," she continued, "things are lost. Lost to time, to memory, to fate." Her lips curled into a faint smile, though it was not one that brought comfort. It was empty, like the smile of someone who knew things they should not. Ethan's head spun. He could barely keep his thoughts straight, the weight of the place bearing down on him. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something ancient and powerful, and it was closing in on him. You said I was bound here. What do you mean?" His voice shook with fear. The woman's smile deepened. "You are lost now, Ethan. You came searching for answers, but now you will stay, as they all do." She took a slow step forward, and Ethan's heart hammered painfully in his chest. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she simply stared at him, her dark eyes reflecting nothing but emptiness. The longer she looked at him, the more he felt as though his very essence was being pulled from his body, as if his soul were being peeled away like layers of skin. And then, she spoke again. "This is where you will stay. You, like the others, will fade into the shadows, forgotten by the world, until the end of time." Ethan felt his breath catch. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to tilt and spin, as though he were falling into the very earth itself. "You can never leave," she repeated softly, her voice like a song sung by a ghost. "This is where the lost go." The ground beneath him cracked open, and in an instant he was falling, plunging into a void of endless blackness, the woman's voice trailing behind him like a mocking lullaby. Chapter 9. Shadows of the Forgotten. Ethan didn't know how long he had been falling. There was no sense of time in the void that had consumed him. It felt endless, a bottomless pit where light could not penetrate, where the very concept of reality dissolved. His screams echoed back to him, but they sounded distant, as though swallowed by the immense emptiness surrounding him. He felt weightless, his body tumbling through space. And for the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, he felt utterly, truly alone. Then, with a sudden bone-jarring jolt, he stopped. His body hit the ground with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. The impact wasn't like hitting solid earth. It was softer, yielding, as if he had fallen onto a bed of ash. He coughed, his throat dry and raw, as he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. His head swam, and his vision was blurred. But he could make out shapes in the dim, suffocating light. The ground was blackened and cracked, like the surface of something that had been burned long ago. Wisps of smoke curled up from the cracks, twisting and writhing in the stagnant air. The air itself was thick with the smell of charred wood and sulfur, and it clung to his skin like a second layer. In the distance, he could see shapes. Tall, jagged spires of rock that pierced the sky like broken teeth. And then, there was the sound. A low, guttural hum that vibrated through the ground, through his bones. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, constant, unrelenting. It wasn't natural. It was alive, like the heartbeat of the place itself. Ethan staggered to his feet, his body trembling. The whispers had returned, faint and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But they were different now. They weren't just words. They were memories. Fragments of thoughts and emotions that weren't his own, swirling around him, pressing against his mind. He clutched his head, trying to block them out, but they seeped into him, relentless. He could see them. Flashes of faces, blurred and distorted. People he didn't know. People whose eyes were wide with fear, their mouths open in silent screams. He saw their lives, their deaths, their final moments of despair before they vanished into the darkness. And then, he realized, they were the forgotten. "Where am I?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "You are where all things come to be forgotten." The voice was behind him, low, resonant, and familiar. Ethan turned sharply, his heart pounding, and saw the woman again. The keeper. She stood a few feet away, her pale figure illuminated by the sickly light that seemed to emanate from the ground. Her black eyes bore into him, unblinking, as if she could see every thought, every fear, every secret he had ever held. "This is the shadow of Willow Creek," she said, her voice echoing in the still air. "The place where the cursed and the lost are bound. This is where the forest keeps its promises." Ethan shook his head, backing away from her. No. I don't belong here. I'm not like them." The keeper tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You've already been chosen, Ethan. The forest has marked you. You are its now." "I didn't choose this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I didn't ask for any of this." Her smile widened. "Few do, but the forest does not care for choice. It only cares for its own." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Why? Why me? The keeper's expression darkened, her smile fading. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. Because you sought it out, she said. Because you came looking for answers, and now you will pay the price. Ethan felt his knees weaken, his chest heaved with shallow breaths, his mind racing. He thought of his mother, of her warnings, of the journals he had found. She had known. She had known about Willow Creek and its curse, and she had tried to keep him away, but he hadn't listened. The keeper raised a hand, and the ground beneath Ethan's feet began to shift. Cracks spread like veins, and from them, shadows poured out. Thick, writhing tendrils of darkness that snaked across the ground, reaching for him. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. Do you see them? The keeper asked, her voice soft but chilling. These are the echoes of those who came before you, the forgotten, the ones who thought they could escape. The tendrils rose, coiling around Ethan's legs, pulling him down. He struggled, clawing at the ground, but the shadows were too strong. They climbed higher, wrapping around his torso, his arms, his neck, until he could barely move. No! He screamed. Please, let me go! The keeper watched him, her expression unreadable. There is no escape, Ethan. You belong to the forest now, to the shadow, to the forgotten. The shadows pulled him down, and for a moment, he thought he would be swallowed whole. But then, the ground beneath him gave way, and he was falling again, plunging into the darkness, the keeper's voice echoing in his ears. When he opened his eyes, he was standing. The ground beneath his feet was solid again, but it was different now. The blackened, cracked earth was gone, replaced by something else entirely. He was in a room, a vast empty chamber with walls that stretched upward into darkness. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the light that illuminated the space came from no discernible source. The room was lined with mirrors. They were tall and narrow, their frames ornate and gilded, and they reflected nothing but darkness. Ethan stepped closer to one, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. The glass was cold beneath his fingertips, and as he stared into it, an image began to form. It was him, but not him. The reflection stared back at him, its face twisted in pain, its eyes hollow and sunken. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, the reflection raised a hand, pressing it against the glass from the other side. Ethan staggered back, his heart pounding. The other mirrors began to light up, one by one, each one showing a different version of him. Older, younger, injured, decayed. Some were screaming, some were crying, and some were simply staring at him with an expression of hopelessness. "This is your fate," the keeper's voice said, though she was nowhere to be seen. "To become one with the shadow, to be forgotten." Ethan shook his head, his eyes darting from mirror to mirror. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." But it was, and as he stared into the mirrors, he realized what they were. They weren't just reflections. They were futures, possibilities, all of them leading to the same end, to the shadow, to the forgotten. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices merging into a deafening roar. The light in the room began to flicker, and the mirrors shattered one by one, their shards scattering across the floor. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head, his screams lost in the chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The room was silent. The keeper appeared before him, her dark eyes unblinking. She knelt beside him, her voice soft but cold. "Do you see now, Ethan? There is no escape. You are already one of us." Ethan looked up at her, his face streaked with tears. "Please," he whispered. "Please, let me go." The keeper tilted her head, considering him for a moment. Then she smiled. "The forest does not let go, Ethan. It only takes." Chapter 10. The Unraveling. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow, and his hands trembled as he stared into the shattered mirrors. Each fragment reflected a different version of himself, twisted, decayed, hollowed out by the darkness that consumed him. The keeper's words echoed in his mind, a cruel mantra. The forest does not let go. It only takes. The weight of those words crushed him like a mountain pressing against his soul. The ground felt unstable beneath him, as if it too was ready to give way. For a moment he wondered if he was losing his grip on reality. Was any of this real? Was he truly standing in the heart of a cursed forest? Or was his mind simply unraveling in the wake of too many horrors? But no matter how hard he tried to deny it, the truth was inescapable. He was here, and this place, this forsaken land, had him now. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting from one broken mirror to the next, all of them staring back at him with malevolent eyes. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead as the whispers grew louder, as though the very walls were closing in on him. Suddenly, there was a shift in the air. The temperature dropped, a chill that seeped into his skin, his bones. The light above flickered, dimming as if it too was weary of its existence. A shadow passed over the room, dark and thick, and with it came an oppressive presence that pressed down on him, suffocating him. Ethan gasped for air, but it was as if the very atmosphere had thickened, turning into a wall of darkness. "You think you can escape?" The keeper's voice rasped from the shadows, a low and hollow sound. It came from all around him, seeping into his ears like a poison. "There is no escape. There is only the cycle, only the taking." Ethan's breath quickened. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind swam in a sea of panic, but his legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. The mirrors seemed to pulse with an unnatural life, their surfaces rippling like water disturbed by unseen currents. And then, something moved in the reflection of one of the mirrors. A figure. It was a man with a face twisted in agony, his eyes wide and pleading, his mouth open in a silent scream. He wasn't alone, though. Behind him, shadows swirled like living smoke, reaching out with tendrils of darkness that wrapped around his limbs. The man was struggling, trying to break free, but the shadows were too strong, too overwhelming. His body contorted as the darkness consumed him, his form dissolving into the very blackness that had once been his prison. Ethan's breath hitched as he watched, transfixed. Was this what awaited him? Was this the fate the keeper had warned him of? "No," Ethan whispered, shaking his head violently. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't let it. He had to find a way out. A cold laugh echoed from the corners of the room, and the keeper materialized before him, her figure almost ethereal in the dim light. She stood as though she had always been there, like the shadows themselves had given birth to her. Her pale eyes glinted with a cruel amusement as she gazed down at him. "You still don't understand, do you?" she asked softly, her voice a mocking whisper. "You are already one of them. The forest has claimed you, and you will remain here forgotten just like all the others." Ethan backed away from her, his mind racing. There has to be a way out. There has to be something I can do. But the more he thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. Everything he had tried had led him further into the heart of this nightmare. Every step he took had only drawn him deeper into the web of Willow Creek's curse. Suddenly, something in the corner of his eye caught his attention. A faint glow, almost imperceptible at first. But it was there, pulsing like a heartbeat, coming from a crack in the wall. Ethan's eyes widened. There was something behind the wall, something that didn't belong to this place. It seemed to call to him, to beckon him with an almost desperate urgency. Without thinking, Ethan turned and ran toward it, his heart thundering in his chest. The keeper's voice called after him, but it was drowned out by the rush of blood in his ears, the pounding of his heart. The glow grew brighter as he approached the crack, and he could feel the heat radiating from it, a warmth that was almost welcoming. He reached the crack and placed his hand against the cold stone. For a moment, nothing happened, but then, with a sudden jolt, the wall shifted, the stones groaning as they began to move. The crack widened, revealing a darkened passage beyond. The air that spilled out was stale, but there was something else too, a sense of release, of something finally giving way. Ethan hesitated. Should he step through? What lay beyond? Was it another trap? Or was it his one chance to escape this nightmare? He didn't have time to think. The keeper's laughter echoed in his ears, and with it came the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming closer. He could feel the weight of her presence behind him, growing stronger, like an invisible hand reaching out to claim him. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward into the passage. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the walls around him began to tremble. The ground shook beneath his feet, as if the entire structure was coming to life. The passage twisted and turned in impossible angles, stretching out in ways that defied all logic. It was a labyrinth, a dark maze of corridors that seemed to go on forever, each turn leading to another dead end, another shadow-filled room. But the glow remained, faint yet persistent, urging him onward. Ethan stumbled, his mind fraying, his body exhausted. The further he went, the darker it became, until even the faint glow was swallowed by the void. He reached out, his hands trembling as he fumbled in the darkness. The whispers came again, louder now, overlapping each other in a chorus of agony. He couldn't tell if they were coming from the walls, the ground, or his own mind. And then, finally, he found it. A door, ancient, worn, and covered in ivy. It was small, almost insignificant, yet it held a sense of finality that he couldn't shake. Ethan pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped into the room beyond. It was a chamber, but not like the others. There was no smoke, no mirrors, no suffocating presence. There was only a single object in the center of the room, a stone pedestal, worn smooth by time, with a small, intricately carved box resting on top. Ethan's hand reached out instinctively. He knew what it was, the key to everything, the answer, his salvation. But as his fingers brushed against the box, a voice, low, mournful, yet full of power, spoke from the shadows. "You've come too late, Ethan." He froze. The voice wasn't the keeper's. It was something else, something older, something more primal. The room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the shadows around him grew deeper, more intense, swirling like a storm. The temperature dropped sharply, and Ethan could see his breath misting in the air. The voice spoke again, but this time it was louder, clearer. "Do you truly think you can undo what's been done? Do you think you can escape what you've unleashed?" Ethan's heart pounded, his thoughts spiraling out of control. The shadows coiled tighter around him, and for the first time he realized he wasn't alone. The forest, the curse itself, was here. It was in this room with him, and it was waiting for him to make his final choice. The box, the pedestal, the key to his salvation, or his destruction. Ethan stood frozen, caught between the darkness and the light, between the past and the future, and as the shadows closed in around him, he finally understood. There was no escaping Willow Creek. There was only becoming it. Chapter 10, Part 2. The Final Embrace. The shadows were alive. Ethan could feel them now, creeping along his skin like cold fingers, like tendrils of the night itself, tightening their grip on his body, his soul. The air around him thickened with a suffocating weight. The room pulsed with a low hum, as though the very walls were breathing, inhaling and exhaling in rhythm with his labored breath. His heart pounded so hard that he could hear it in his ears. And yet, through the roaring silence of his mind, there was one thought: you cannot escape. It wasn't just the keeper who was here now. The presence was deeper, darker. It had no form, no face, only the weight of ages pressing down on him. The air crackled with the ancient energy of the forest. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corners of the room whispered promises of what was to come. And in the center, the box remained. Ethan's hand lingered above it, the cool surface of the stone pedestal vibrating beneath his fingertips. The urge to touch it, to open it, was overwhelming. The whispers seemed to grow louder the closer he got, speaking his name in voices that were familiar and strange at once. His own name, distorted, pleading, twisted with malice. It was like a song, a chant that filled his head, drowning him in the sound of his own dread. But something in him still fought. It wasn't much, just the smallest flicker of defiance, a breath of resistance, but it was enough to make him hesitate. The door behind him, the one he had just entered through, had closed silently, And now the room was sealed. Trapped, the whispers became sharper, more insistent, clawing at his thoughts like fingernails dragging across glass. There was no going back. With a shaky breath, Ethan pulled his hand away from the pedestal. His eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that might offer a hint, a way out. But there was nothing. Only the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and the ever-encroaching darkness. He realized, with growing horror, that the box wasn't just a key. It was a lure, a trap, a test. "You've come this far," the voice spoke again. But this time it wasn't just from the shadows. It was coming from everywhere, reverberating through his very bones. "You thought you could defy the forest. You thought you could resist the inevitable. But in the end, Ethan, you're just like them. Just another lost soul." Ethan's mind reeled. Lost soul? Was that what he had become? He remembered the people who had gone before him, the ones whose faces he had seen reflected in the mirrors, the ones who had vanished into the forest depths, never to return. Were they all part of the same pattern? Were they all destined to become part of the forest, bound to its will, to its curse? No, he thought, his mind fighting against the overwhelming sense of inevitability. No, I won't be like them. I won't become another nameless ghost in the dark. But even as he thought this, his legs began to tremble. His mind swirled with the memories of the keeper's cryptic words, of the visions of the forest, of the stories he had heard over the years. Everything was connected. His arrival here, the strange pull he felt to the forest, the way it seemed to call to him from the very first moment. It was as if the forest had known, had been waiting for him, for this moment. The whispering grew louder, more forceful. It wasn't just in his ears now. It was in his head, inside his chest, vibrating through his skull. "You cannot leave." The words echoed over and over, each repetition sinking deeper into his thoughts. And then the shadows moved. They rose up from the ground, twisting and writhing like smoke, their forms coalescing into something dark, something ancient. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, imposing shape, its features obscured by the swirling mists. It was a thing of darkness, a figure woven from the very essence of the forest. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed like molten amber, piercing the gloom like twin burning coals. The thing stepped forward, its presence filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. The temperature dropped even further, until Ethan could see his breath crystallizing in the air. "You've come to claim what's not yours," the figure spoke, its voice a low growl that sent shivers through Ethan's spine. "But nothing here is ever yours. The forest does not belong to anyone. It is a force, a living entity, and you are merely a fleeting distraction." Ethan tried to move, but his legs refused to obey. He was frozen, unable to tear his gaze away from the creature's burning eyes. There was a terrible, ancient wisdom in them, and for a moment, he could feel the weight of all the souls that had been trapped here before him. The keeper's voice rang in his ears, reminding him of the forest's unyielding nature, of the cycles of suffering it had woven into its very roots. There was no escape. "You're not the first," the figure continued, stepping closer, "but you will be the last." Ethan felt a chill seep deep into his soul, like ice filling his veins. He wanted to scream, to break free, to run, but he couldn't. His mind was shrouded in fog, his thoughts tangled and confused. The forest's pull was stronger than ever, wrapping itself around his heart like a vice, squeezing the life out of him. The figure moved again, closer still, until it stood directly in front of him. Its hand reached out, impossibly long fingers curling toward his face, and Ethan's body screamed at him to move, but he couldn't. It was as if the very air had thickened, like the room itself was holding him captive. "Join us," the figure whispered, its voice like the wind through dead leaves. "Become one with the forest. Become a part of the eternal night." Ethan's thoughts fragmented as the figure's fingers touched his skin. He felt a coldness, a terrible emptiness that filled him from the inside out. His body seemed to freeze in place as the figure's touch reached deeper into his soul, pulling him toward the darkness. He could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever before, filling his mind with the voices of the lost souls, the ones who had been claimed by Willow Creek. Join us. The word echoed in his mind like a death knell, but something, deep within him, stirred. Ethan forced his hand to move. He didn't know how, didn't know why, but his fingers trembled as they closed around the carved box resting on the pedestal. The moment his fingers touched it, the room seemed to shift. The shadows receded. The figure stepped back, its grip loosening on his soul. The box. It was the key. He knew it, deep in his bones. With a final, desperate push, Ethan opened the box. A blinding light erupted from within, flooding the room with pure, incandescent brilliance. The shadow screamed in agony, writhing away from the light as if burned by its very touch. The figure howled, its form disintegrating in the face of the blinding power, and for the first time since he had arrived, Ethan felt the pressure lifting, the weight on his chest easing. The forest recoiled. The light grew brighter, and then, with a sudden pulse, everything went silent. The room, the shadows, the whispers, they were gone. The air cleared, and Ethan stood alone, his heart racing in his chest. The blinding light faded to nothing, leaving him standing in the dark once again. But this time it was different. The suffocating presence was gone. The curse had been lifted. Or so he thought. In the silence, a single voice reached his ears, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "You think you've won?" the keeper's voice whispered from nowhere. "This is just the beginning. The forest doesn't let go, Ethan. It only waits." And with that, the world around him began to shift again. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the shadows rose once more. There is no escape.